I am to be in a classroom and see faces and hug people. It's wonderful to be back in the classroom. And we have about at least 20 people in the classroom, and I understand from Zoomers there are probably hundreds out there watching from as they're zooming in. So we're looking forward to this. This is the first of a 4-session series about He is risen, stories of the resurrection. The reason why I'm confused is that David Brower has taught a number of courses here. Earlier, I think it was last fall, he taught sort of like a bookend to this course. This is about resurrection, but in the fall, he taught about creation courses. And so he's at both parts of the Christian spectrum here, I think, creation to resurrection. But he's also taught some other courses. He's very active in social justice issues. And I remember taking a class from him called Waking Up White, a book by Debbie Irving. And that, I think, maybe led even to the creation of a special interest group that would meet to discuss other books that were related to racism. Another thing that David is noted for is that he started the HASP Hikers. It's a group that in the springtime, especially and in the summertime, would get together and hike around various parks in Ottawa County, some in Allegan County. He has an interesting background. He grew up the son of Baptist missionaries, and he lived for a time in the Belgian Congo. Later on, he received a bachelor's degree from Cornerstone College and a master's degree from Western Michigan University. And he briefly taught social sciences at the secondary and community college levels. He later earned a master's of divinity degree from Episcopal Divinity Seminary, and he's been an Episcopal priest for more than 35 years. We're ready. Yeah, please welcome David Brower.
Thank you, Judith. We are having this class in the afternoon because Joni said to me, "Don't you dare have a class in the morning because I can't come to it." So I have with me 3 books, which I will refer to. But next time, and the 2 times afterwards, you're going to be Bible-toting Baptists. Because we're going to be referring to a lot of biblical texts, particularly next session, which is looking at all of the texts that have a resurrection theme in all of the Bible. And then the last 2 sessions will focus on the gospel accounts of the resurrection. So you'll be a Bible thumper by the time you're done. This morning, though, or not this morning, this afternoon, we're going to be dealing with the broad scope of resurrection. And it is a broad scope. So I'd like to begin our sort of contemplation on it by looking at resurrection as it is acted out, themed out in our daily life. So we are right now, right at the cusp of spring, right? What is spring all about? It's renewal, it's resurrection. I mean, plants die, they go into the ground, and then they're resurrected. And it's no wonder that New Year's celebrations across the spectrum of humanity generally are a springtime, well, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, are a springtime phenomena, because that's the motif of new life, is spring. So one of the major frameworks, I think, for resurrection is thinking of the world around us. Springtime and new life and all of that. I get energized with spring, by the way, because I've been dormant for too long. And spring just allows me to get back out into the yard, into the garden, into the wild, because it's new lifetime. But there's other dimensions of new life beyond the biological phenomena. What about the stars? How many of you are stargazers? Well, not many, but you ought to be, because it's wonderful, particularly in this time of beginning of springtime. What's the major constellation that's springtime? Orion. So you can see Orion there in the southwest, no, southwest over this way, and surrounded by Ursula Major, Ursula Minor, and other wonderful objects. But we're all stardust, aren't we? You've heard that refrain before. Because stars go through death and resurrection. Stars, our star, the sun. Sometime now, a couple billion years from now, it will die. We won't be there, but it will die and it will decompose. And out of that decomposed matter, new stars will be born. And astronomers who study the sky will talk about red dwarfs and black holes and new stars forming. So it's larger than just what we have here on planet Earth. There is a recyclical nature to a lot of this biological astronomical phenomena. It's not just a one-time thing. When we think of the resurrection stories of the Bible, it's a one-time thing. Although we do reenact that one-time thing frequently. In the Episcopal Church, whenever we have a baptism, or even when we celebrate the baptism of Jesus, we all do a renewal of our baptismal covenant, because it's a recurring theme for us in our journey that death and resurrection is a part of the whole journey. If you were a member of the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, you would go through an annual rebaptism. The whole congregation jumps into the water and is rebaptized at the baptism of Jesus. So, and if any of you are lucky enough to have been brought up Baptist, so you got dunked as a teenager, you know something about the power of that image of death and resurrection, because you're buried in the primordial waters, which a lot of the creation themes come out of the primordial waters, and then you're born again. So if anybody says to you, if you've ever been born again, yeah, I'm baptized. I went through that. So these themes of resurrection are predominant in our world thing. Anybody have a comment they want to make about that? Judith will go around with the microphone.
Anytime you have a comment, just raise your hand. I'll bring a mic to you so everyone can hear, those in Zoom land as well as the classroom.
So we tend to think of the annual cycle of the years as based on the solar system, right? I mean, we're just about ready to have the spring equinox, and our New Year's celebration is at the winter solstice. So there are two different kind of cycles, if you wish, in the natural world. The one based on the solar system, but there's the lunar system. And hence, that's why we celebrate Easter in March, because that's based on the lunar calendar rather than the solar calendar. So, and if we grew up in a different kind of culture, a matriarchal culture, the lunar would be far more important than the celestial. But we're all products of patriarchy, and so we sort of hang on with the boys. So, and speaking of New Year festivals, one of the things that we do at Christmas, you may not sing it yourself, but you certainly hear it, is the 12 days of Christmas. We think of it as a silly little ditty game, but 12 days is ancient in the world, because at the beginning of the new year, you rehearsed the 12 months of the year. And so the 12 days of Christmas are part of that sort of rehearsing of the 12 months that are going to be coming. So think about that next time when you get vexed about hearing for the umpteenth time, 12 days of Christmas. Think of it as, okay, that's what we're doing. The other one that I nuanced that I want to list to you for symbols that go on is the lunar calendar. The moon is full moon right now, right? When it is an old moon, before the new moon arises, there are 3 nights of darkness. Check it out. There'll be 3 nights of darkness. What do we have in the resurrection story? Jesus in the grave for 3 nights, 3 days. So we're much more connected to these cycles of nature, symbolic cycles, and so on. So it's a motif that permeates throughout our world and throughout our religious world. So now to jump to some of these other stuff. You all got this handout. Well, there are some copies of it. If you're Luddite like me and didn't get it online, who needs a copy? I think you'll have to get them from Susan. Susan, where are you?
How many copies do you need?
Yeah, she had made several copies, so here she comes.
Do you need them for the entire class? I
Well,
emailed
there's
them out.
4
No,
or
I'd be
5
happy to. So
There's
yeah,
4 or 5 people that don't have them.
absolutely. And I understand not everybody has a printer. And so I would be more than happy to. So raise your hand if you need one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'll make 10.
Thank you, Susan. So this book by Morton Kelsey, have any of you read any of his stuff before? Episcopal priest, a Jungian analyst, and Jungians deal a lot with myth. They not only recount the myths, but they look at them psychologically in terms of what's going on in our inner self. And so Morton Kelsey, who was at Notre Dame for a long time, put together this book, Myth, History, and Faith, which summarized some of the major stories about creation from perspectives of other traditions. When I grew up in the Baptist church, I was told, and I believed it because I believed everything as a Baptist would tell you, that Christianity is unique It's the only religion that has a death and resurrection of God. So I believe that. Well, when you read this and you read more about archetypical imagery of death and resurrection, it's much more pervasive than just uniquely Christian. So that's what Morton Kelsey tries to do with this little essay on the dying and rising of God. And he picks out certain mythic stories that are really central to understanding this. Now, probably the difference between those stories and the story of the resurrection in the Bible is that we can say that the resurrection of Jesus is historical. Some of it anyway. The resurrection appearances are probably not historical because nobody was there. But we do know, we claim Jesus was a historical person. And it's, in addition to the Bible, there are at least references to Jesus in other literature. Whereas these mythic stories of creation, most of them are creation related, those are not historical. Those are peoples of the earth trying to understand how we got here and what's our journey. So all religions like to talk about a beginning and an ending. We have it, of course, in our biblical story. We have the beginning, the creation story, but we have the ending in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. And depending on how literal you are, you might get really nervous and upset about what Revelation seems to portend, or you might look at it as another kind of dream encounter, another mythic kind of thing. But it's about the ending of what began at the beginning of the book of the Bible. So these stories in here are really fascinating stories, and I want to refer particularly to the story of Orisis and Isis, the Greek story. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that story from reading world history. It's Egyptian in its origin. And according to the story, Orisis was the god of fertility and the god of agriculture. And he was in Egypt. So his celebrations were cyclical. That is because every year there would be a drought on the Nile because Africa had a dry season, and the drought would affect the crops. But then there would be springtime or the new rains coming, and the Nile River would flood over the banks. So Orisis was really, and then Isis was a significant focal point for the ancient religions of Egypt. So the way the story goes, Orisis, who traveled all over the place, gods can do that, you know, and he was always accounted for bringing in plenty and stability to Egypt. One story sort of has it that Egypt, before he appeared on the scene, was just a land of absolute turmoil, and nothing else was really, it was one of the themes of creation is creating out of chaos. And Egypt was chaos. So Orisis brought order and brought fecundity, fertility into the land. and his consort was Isis. Now, as he was going around and doing this stuff, he had a brother named Set. Set was jealous of Orisis. So he created a festival and made this ornate casket. And the theme was that whoever could fit into the casket could have it. Because there is a theme in a lot of Greek religion, in Egyptian religion, about death and dealing with death. Well, all of these different gods and people tried to get into the casket, and none of them fit.
That, but you're
What?
mad at you just muted yourself.
So Set and his companions shut the door or the casket, soldered it tight, and sent him off the casket into the Nile River, because that was his way of getting rid of him. Well, the Nile River, the casket floated in the Nile River, eventually came on a bank, and right at where it landed, this huge tree grew up right over the casket. Well, at one point, a queen of somewhere found this tree and wanted it for the pillar of her castle. So they cut down the tree, the casket's inside, and take it to the palace where they're building, and the tree is installed. Isis is just beside herself. And by the way, Morton Kelsey and Jungians make a great deal of any kind of interaction between male and female in these mythic stories, because the way they understand it is it's the battle within us between our masculine and feminine sides. And so Isis, who is just totally distraught with her husband and doesn't know where he is, finds out that this casket in the tree is at this palace in Syria. She can't go there directly to try to claim it. So she poses as a cleaning lady. And she goes to the palace and she starts doing her stuff. And they give her custody of this little baby that was in the palace. She wants to make the baby immortal. So every night when everybody is gone, she takes the baby and puts it in the fire so that it will gradually become immortal. Well, one day the queen sees this happening and thinks her baby is going to be burned to death. And so they, arrest her and whatever. And finally, when she tells her story, they decide they're going to take the tree down or the pillar down and let her take the casket. So she is just beside herself with delight that her Orisis is back. Well, she can't take it back to Egypt because Set is now ruling. So she takes it back and puts it in the rushes of the Nile River. Remember, that's where Moses got put. Sometimes these stories get interwoven with each other. And goes and visits it every day. And then Set, who knows something is going on, disguises himself as a snake and slithers through the rushes and finds the casket. So he proceeds to cut Orisis into 14 pieces and scatters it all the way around Egypt. So now Isis is on the second journey, which is try to recover the pieces of her beloved, and can't quite make it. She finds 13 of them. She can't find the 14th one. Which one would you think it would be? The phallus. You got to think a little mystically, but anyway, so she makes an artificial phallus, and through some process, it becomes alive. And at that point, the son of Set is now ruler, and they can work out getting back into the role that they had, which was Isis and Orisis. Except that in the process of putting this phallus back, Orisis gets condemned to the underworld. And so hence you have Orisis, who is the god of the underworld during the time of dormancy, and then comes back up during the rains to be the god of fertility. It's fascinating how these stories interweave with each other. So that's a theme of Isis and Orisis, but you have similar themes with other mythic stories. Persephone and her mother. What's her mother's name? Which is a Greek story, but a very similar story. Demeter and Persephone. Demeter is the queen mother, and Persephone is a little girl running around in the world and having a great time. And then this god, I can't remember which god it was, one of the Greek gods, decides to elope Persephone and takes her as the god of Hades of the underworld, takes her to the underworld. Demeter is just absolutely distraught because her daughter is gone, her daughter that she loved. And so hence, eventually she goes to Zeus to try to intervene. Eventually there is an intervention, but Zeus cannot override Hades. So she is allowed to come back up to the surface for 6 months every year, and then has to go back down into the underworld for 6 months. So that's how the myths of the Greeks, which are very similar to the myths of the Egyptians, have this theme of 6 months of dormancy, 6 months of winter, and then 6 months of fecundity. And in that little write-up I gave you, there's several other similar stories coming from that era of the sort of birthing of civilization, if you wish, in Egypt and in the Fertile Crescent. Now, there are similar stories, and I don't have them as elaborately detailed, but there's similar stories from other traditions. African, Native American, Asian. The one that we probably may know more about is the Native American traditions, at least some of us who've read it. And in the Native American tradition, the buffalo woman, white buffalo woman, this comes out of the Lakota. And she similarly brings all kinds of hope and promise to the people, but she dies. And out of her death comes the sources of part of the life of the Lakota people, particularly the Black Hills, because in the Lakota tradition, that is the heart of the Lakota society. So there's a similar kind of mythic story in at least that part of the Native American tradition. Have any of you encountered any other kind of mythic stories that relate to gods and goddesses?
The Chinese have a story about Pangu. Pangu was a god, and in his dying, the parts of him, various parts, maybe blood veins and bones, become aspects of creation. It's the death of a god that results in the creation of the world. I didn't learn this until I went to China and actually heard that, because I was going to teach them the creation story, and they heard my creation story, and I learned their story about Pangu. It was a great interchange. And then I told them the story about the blind man and an elephant, and how various parts of reality that we see, if we only see one part and not the other parts, it's often distorted. And I think having David here with his feet in anthropology as well as theology and Christianity as well as myth, you bring us that perspective, and thank you. As far as Underworld, the Gilgamesh Epic, I don't know if any of you have read that. The Gilgamesh Epic has a friendship between Gilgamesh and a fellow named Enkidu. And Enkidu dies, and there's just a great mourning of Gilgamesh, and he wants to find out where he went when he died, and he has a visit to the underworld. And of course, in Greek epic, the Odyssey, has Odysseus going to the underworld. Circe advises that he needs to go there to learn things that he needs to know before he returns home. So it's just fascinating how these themes interweave in really old mythic kinds of stories. Anybody else?
In our Christian tradition, we don't deal with the underworld as much as other traditions or cultures do. But if we remember who's the author who does the journey to the underworld? Homer? Yeah,
Homer.
No, not Homer. No, I was thinking of the more recent author who did. Who?
Dante.
Yeah, Dante. Dante's journey into the underworld is really not totally dissimilar from some of these other journeys going into the underworld. The reality is that most societies don't know what to do with death, because death happens, but most people try to avoid it. And so the ones who are,
We are all trying.
But so a lot of traditions have a way of dealing with death metaphorically, that therefore it's not as such a fearsome thing, because there's another dimension of reality that comes after that. Part of the problem that we have had it in our Christian tradition is we have the death doorway into two spheres. One, we think, okay, heaven's okay, that's good. But then hell, well, that's another thing. So, and we live with, because of our patriarchal religious orientation, we live in fear of hell, because we may have to go there and we don't want to. So in fact, if I might digress a moment, are any of you familiar with the book by Rob Bell called Love Wins? He was, a darling of the evangelical community in the Grand Rapids area, and wrote a book. His first book was called The Velvet Elvis, which is kind of fascinating. But then he wrote Love Wins. And the evangelical community did not like that at all, because he calls into question the whole idea that if God is a God of love, how can that God send people to hell? So we need hell because we need hell to send people to. So that's, a continuing theme in a lot of these gods and goddesses stories is, how do we deal with the abyss, the underworld, and make sense out of it? And that's precisely what the different religious traditions try to do. Yes.
Have you heard what Mark Twain said about heaven and hell?
Question
No, but
is,
I
have you
think
heard
wait
about what Mark
until
Twain?
Judy brings the mic, and then you'll alert all of us.
Okay, Mark Twain said there are advantages to both. Heaven for the climate, hell for the company.
That's a great story.
Have you ever tied other kinds of, I don't know if we would call them myths, but like the Loch Ness Monster, I grew up with a Jersey Devil. There's a book, I'm from Jersey. And that devil went all over the marshlands and would, take babies. And there is the Loch Ness Monster or the Bigfoot. Are all those sort of like myths from the fear of death, do you think?
Well, first of all, we ought to just make a comment about the term myths. A lot of people are very uncomfortable in talking about the Bible as myth. So hence we have this struggle between the creationists who believe that the Genesis story is a literal story, and those who take a more metaphorical or mythical view of the creation story. So there's a lot of nervousness, particularly us modern, educated people, in dealing with myth. It takes somebody like Morton Kelsey or other people who say, yeah, myths are good because they're the basis for understanding life, not only how it came, but life as it is now. So these mythic creatures that appear from time to time in popular stories, in Tolkien or fantasy literature, they're real in the sense that they tap into that part of us that wants to deal with life on a mythic level, not just on a literal level. So whatever mythic creatures we want to concoct, they become real. So think, for example, the devil. We all have an image of whatever the devil is, but it's our way of dealing with evil in the world. I mean, it can be on a very trivial level, like saying, oh, the devil made me do it. But we all want to have a source of evil that impugns and influences how we live and how we behave. And it's mythic. I mean, if you look at the biblical story, there's really the only, when Satan is introduced anywhere, think of the book of Job, Satan is the tester. It's not the one who leads us into evil, as we say in the Lord's Prayer. It's the one who is testing us to see how we are going to behave in this situation or that situation. So it's a very different kind of image of the devil than what we're given in these mythic stories. So myth is a good thing, but we have a hard time with it in our modern scientific age because we want everything to be amenable to scientific analysis. And how can you analyze a mythic story scientifically? It's pretty difficult. Thank you. That's a good question. Anything else about, yes, back over here.
Well, there's a whole nother belief system, which is reincarnation. So it's not here moving on to the next place. Rather, I will stay here again and again. And perhaps I learn from this life, I can accept it, but my next life here will be different. So how does that fit in with this? So do you know why a whole different belief system, contrary to this one?
Yeah, and I have to be very honest, I have never really studied or wrestled with that image of reincarnation. What I am a little bit in tune with is that some of the New Age material that I've read similarly has the mantra usually is, well, if you're going through this kind of turmoil in your life, it had to be that you did something in your previous life that's impacting on what you're doing now. I have a hard time getting my mind wrapped around that, but I've heard that quite often. I don't know enough about the whole Hindu idea of reincarnation, if that relates to that or not, or if it's just the cycles that we go through, but we don't have any memory of what happened before to what we are now. I mean, another term that gets passed around that's somewhat related is karma. And that may not be the same as reincarnation, but it's sort of like, if you have bad karma, it might not be just your own choices. It may be choices that were made in a previous life, a previous existence, or whatever. So, I mean, we like to think of everything nice and lineal and straightforward, and then it's not that way.
In the Western tradition, Plato in his Republic, I think it's book 10, has a part that's called the myth. And in that, he talks about reincarnation. So it's,
Oh, really?
And maybe he was influenced by some Hindu stories to have brought that into his own writing. But it's part of the Western tradition, but it didn't follow through. I don't think too many people from, let's say, the Reformation on in Christianity, for example, believe in any kind of reincarnation. It's sort of it's an idea that doesn't compel people.
Yeah, and I think your comment about Plato being influenced by other traditions, there was much more in my reading of world history, cross-fertilization of different ideas, different value systems, different mythic systems than what we've grown up with. A very slanted, if you wish, history growing up in the Western world. You know, we begin with the Greeks and Romans, and then we don't take about anybody else until we get to World War II or World War I. I mean, that's the unfortunate part of, and I'll use the term that the Russians used, we were brainwashed into a certain mindset that became the mindset, the dominant mindset. Yeah, thank you. Anything else about the sort of larger picture of, there's a comment over there.
Fiction that we find satisfying generally follows the pattern of home, away, and home. And when I think about resurrection, it's the same thing. It's home, away, and home. Especially in children's literature, you'll see that theme.
So home is where we are, right? And then away is our journey away. Because there's a lot of literature that talks about how we, when we're born, grow up in a mindset that puts us in compatibility with God. And then we go through a lifelong journey of sort of distancing ourselves from that until we come back home towards the end of life's journey. Maybe that's part of us. We're all sort of homeward bound, huh?
I just have a question about where predestination came in and what it means.
You know, I should defer to some Calvinists who are in the congregation, because it's never been for me as a Baptist kid or even as an Episcopal priest to get comfortable with the idea of predestination, that God destines certain people for salvation and others not. It seems like, I mean, in my cavalier way of reading it, it seems like God is kind of cavalier. I mean, it's just choosing, oh, I'll choose these and I'll not choose those. And I know that's not a fair treatment of predestination. Maybe John should do a class on predestination sometime.
John's a Methodist.
Do I hit that or what?
Yes, you're just. No,
I got my hands that go in everywhere.
It's fine. There's a mute button and I think that sometimes you might be swiping it. Could you repeat that comment? I'm sure it was in
My comment was,
Wait, Susan.
the question was, where
How
does
do we get
predestination
people
come in
from
on
the
this,
Zoom
and
land?
where
They have
in
comments or
Christianity does
questions?
predestination really arise from? And David
Yeah.
had suggested that this is part of the Calvinistic strain
So do we have
of
any-
Protestantism,
okay.
where we get this notion of predestination. That is, before we were even born, God had chosen certain ones that will get the reward of heaven, and others who have the reward of hell. And I just simply indicated that I think it's tied to a notion, a definition of God as omniscient, that is all knowing, and omnipotent, all powerful, a sovereignty of God. God is such that God can decide what God wants, and that will happen. It takes away any kind of free will from human beings, and it makes human beings almost like puppets. And so a number of people have objected to this predestination, and it's God somehow making the choices that make human activity kind of meaningless as far as consequences, because it's all decided ahead of time.
Could it have any bearing on being adapted from the chosen people realm?
I mean, again, I'm not a theologian in the Calvinistic sense, but there is some nuance about being chosen. And I think predestination, as Judy was saying, has that element to it. The thing that I remember growing up with is you didn't know which camp you were in, so you better behave anyway, because you didn't know whether you were chosen or not chosen. There was a comment over here somewhere, I thought. Do we
As
have
she's-
any comments
she's
from Zoom land?
Yes, I was just going to say, as she's passing the mic, if you're at home, I've opened the chat and you can put your questions there, or perhaps if you'd like to unmute yourself, just make sure you speak loudly. But I would suggest putting it in chat. And you don't currently have anything right now, David.
Okay. All right. Well, anything else? Gosh, we got another half an hour to befuddle everybody with. So for next week, I'm going to, I'm just going to make this, I'm going to take us through, beginning with the Old Testament and the story of Enoch. You might know the story of Enoch, but he did not die. So there's a certain kind of resurrection motif, if you wish. But we're going to go through the Old Testament. There are some resurrection stories in the Old Testament, literal resurrections, dealing with Elijah and Elisha, and then look at other resurrection stories that are in the New Testament, other than the 4 gospel accounts. The only diversion I will do from that path is looking at the text from 1 Corinthians. Because actually that's, if you wish, it's the first resurrection story in the terms of how the New Testament was written. The Gospels were written after 1 Corinthians, but Paul doesn't say he observed the resurrection. He says, I learned it from other people. And then he goes on to tell his story of the resurrection. So we will do that one, but all of the other stories. And so I do have an assignment for you. And that is, you all are biblical scholars, right, of one sort or another. Go through and write down what you think are resurrection stories from the biblical material that you are familiar with. And I may cover them, and you may come up with some that I haven't covered. All right, John has a comment.
Yeah, we're talking about the joys of spring.
Mhm.
What we love, my wife and I, in our little lake, is the return of the ducks.
Oh, yeah.
And life there, and we've got a really cool couple. We call them the odd couple. It's a very white duck, totally bonded to a gray duck, and we never see them apart from each other more than 20 feet. It's just fun to watch them.
And do they have babies?
Not that we know of.
Okay, so that's another theme of Easter time, eggs. I'm sure most of you as kids went out on Easter egg hunts, but the egg has often been a symbol of Easter, of springtime, of resurrection, because if you have any connection to bird life, whether domestic or wild, they don't lay eggs in the wintertime. There's not the availability of food. The only exception might be, it's pushing it a little bit, but the horned owls start laying their eggs in February. But by the time the eggs hatch, there's food around that they can get. And the bald eagles right next to us on Byron Center Road, they're beginning to incubate their eggs. So there are, but that fits within the egg metaphor of springtime.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yes.
What led you from being Baptist to Episcopalian?
Well, the quick and easy answer is I came into a church that loved and encouraged questions. When I grew up in the Baptist church, if you started questioning anything that was sort of the dogma, there was something wrong with you. You were backsliding. And so when we started going to the Episcopal Church in Kalamazoo, I loved a church where we could question, where we could wrestle with issues. And I didn't experience that in my Baptist upbringing. So that's the quick, easy. There's a longer story, but I won't go into that.
I have a question about Islam and the Judaic,
Judaism?
pardon?
Judaism?
Yes.
Yeah, we refer to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all as being the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
So The Bible, the Old Testament, is the Bible of the Hebrew tradition. And in Islam, the Bible is acknowledged as a sacred book along with the Quran. So the traditions are not totally dissimilar. But as long as we're probing into myth, all that you've read about Abraham in the Old Testament is myth. It's not history, but we know about that and we hear wonderful stories about Abraham, but it's not historical in that sense. But all three of those religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are all based on the same tradition. Maybe that's not your question. Well, the Hebrew Bible is what we call the Old Testament. It is the Bible that was written originally in Hebrew. And then when you get towards the end of what we think of the biblical Old Testament story, there's some correlation between books like, let's say, the book of Daniel. Some of it was written in Hebrew, some of it in Aramaic because of the Alexander the Great and the Greek dominance of the thinking world. And then, of course, if you get to, if you have a Bible that has the Apocrypha, that's all written in Greek because it was written in that intertestamental period between Hebrew and the Greek New Testament.
Didn't Abraham have two sons, so that his first son,
His first son was Ishmael,
and that's
and that's claimed to be the progenitor of Islam.
okay.
And they have as much trouble with the historicity of that as we do with Abraham, but that's okay.
I want you to follow up just a little bit about that difficulty of historicity of Abraham. What particular facts or whatever, what evidence is there to give substance to the fact that it's not history? Curious.
Well, historians like to anchor their understanding of history by correlating different readings and different sources of information. All we have about Abraham is from the Hebrew Bible. There's no correlating other evidence to document this thing or that thing. So, for example, and it's an important event in the Hebrew tradition as well as Christian, the Exodus event. There is no historical documentation of a group of Hebrew people living as slaves in Egypt and being expelled or leaving that country. There is a lot of history of people as slaves. I mean, the pyramids were built by slaves. So there's certainly that kind of documentation, but there's no documentation, corroborating documentation about the Exodus event. So, I mean, I think that's what distinguishes between history as history and we don't probably want to use it myth because it gets so misconstrued, but something that is not specifically historical, well, it's kind of mythic. And myth is okay. We've grown up with a hard time with myth.
I'm sure you're getting this, but myth can have truth.
Oh, yeah.
Even, I mean, I think about a very different thing. A novel, is made up story based on a lot of observations. It's not historical, but it can be very, very meaningful.
Mhm.
And that's true for biblical myth too. It can be very, very meaningful.
One of my favorite New Testament scholars, Marcus Borg, died just a couple years ago. but he was famous for saying, the Bible is true, but not literally true. And it was his way of looking at the biblical stories as metaphorical. And in his sense of that, they're more profound that way, metaphorically, than they are being literally true. So, I mean, the creation story, it's a metaphorical way of understanding creation. Similar to, but quite different from other creation stories from other parts of the world. I mean, probably the major differences in the person or the entity of Yahweh, because most creation stories have the gods interacting with people, not, and there's a little bit of that in the creation story, particularly in chapter 2 of Genesis, but God speaks the word and then it happens. So there's quite a different kind of nuance of that creation story.
And you get a greater richness to the stories if you do understand it metaphorically, because metaphor, it could be more than just one metaphor that helps to unfold the story. If you just take a literal approach and there's only one way to interpret that, it seems very limiting. And some people like to have the certainty of just, one understanding of it, and it happens to be theirs.
Hence why I left the Baptist church. Because there was one truth and you had to learn that one truth. And if you questioned the one truth, there was something spiritually wrong with you. You needed a spiritual advisor to straighten you out.
But not all Baptist churches.
You're right.
Very good Baptist churches.
Yes, there's a much broader spectrum in the Baptist tradition than what I grew up with. Just as there is in the Episcopal Church, which I am a part of. I mean, there's some people here who grew up in a much more conservative Episcopal tradition than the one that is a part that I grew up in. So it's interesting, we attach these denominational labels on Christians and don't acknowledge the diversity that's part of those labels. So the Reformed Church is struggling with that right now, and the Methodist Church.
I just have a funny little story. When I was young, growing up in a small town, there was a Baptist church. And when you walked in the front door, I mean, there was a little places you could kind of hide. And it was real close to the street. And when I walked by there, I was afraid they were going to grab me because their teachings were scary. I was, they had Baptist, young people that they wanted to bring in for summer Bible school. And so my sister and I got hooked, grabbed a few times from friends, and their Bible school was scary. The serpent and are you saved? They kept drumming that into you. And I mean, to me, it was scary before even walking by the church as a youngster.
And to piggyback on that a bit, one of the things that we have to look at our own theology and how we express it and how we live it out. How scary might that be to people from a different tradition, different even Christian tradition? So there's elements of anything that can be, maybe scary is not the right word, but it's if you're a little kid, it is scary. Okay.
Right. In regards to myth, I think maybe you're going that direction. Is the story is what's important, because in the older churches, you had, like when we went to Europe, old Catholic churches, they had panels. And the point is, people would go in front and someone would tell the story. There is no scripture. Or for scripture, it's Latin, which people didn't understand. So it was the story and the picture, the multimedia effect of being in the church, the large church, the smells, maybe there's incense. And so that's how I take this, not in these dry words on a piece of paper. That is not the point of how the story came. It was not written originally. It was part of this environment of passing the word along.
I think that comment is really wonderful because, in fact, it's why I chose the title of this being Resurrection Stories, because it really is about stories. And if you're dealing with a metaphorical or a literal interpretation, whichever way, it still is the story. That's the cardinal point. And one of the problems we have as literate people is we get so stuck with the written page as being the truth. I grew up in an African culture where it was all story. And the storytellers would tell stories that later anthropologists want to write down, but they miss the power of the story because the story is oral. It's not written down. So, I mean, I think that's part of the problem we have with this book, the Bible.
Which started out as oral, at least my understanding is that the first 5 books, Pentateuch, are outcome of a long tradition of oral tradition of storytelling.
Mhm.
And it got written down partly, I think, at the time when the Hebrews had to leave. They were in exile and they weren't in their tabernacle or their holy place anymore. And so they were thinking, some people are going to forget these stories. We need to make sure that they're written down. And hence we have the Bible that came down to us through millennia.
Generally, I think when a people go through trauma, whether it's being exported to another country or the Holocaust, there is a desire, a need to write down what happened. And that's good, but then we tend to literalize that rather than allowing it to be story. One of the greatest things I think that's happening nowadays in the educational system, at least as I hear it, is young children, 1st and 2nd grade kindergarten, are being subjected again to stories, storytelling time. And it's a great way because it's you, through the stories, you learn the truth, but it's not the literal truth. All right, I think we've done enough pontificating with each other for a while. So bring your Bibles next time. If you don't have it, it's okay. But there will be some of us who will have them, and we'll do Bible talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for everybody at home. And there weren't any questions in the chat, but we'll encourage people to open their mic or put their questions into chat. But thank you. Do you have anything else you want to do to close? Okay, everybody have a wonderful day.
And just on a final note, Judith was gracious enough to come and step in as coordinator because Douglas, who is the designated coordinator, was not going to be here, but now he is here. So,
So you'll get Douglas next time and you get him to introduce David.